welcome back to our podcast. I'm the Disturbed Southern Belle.
And I'm the gentleman.
On this episode, we're continuing on talking about some more of the outlaws from around the world, and this episode we've got a very interesting batch, and they're known as the Bloody Benders. So, the Bender family, better known as the Bloody Benders, was a family of serial killers from Lubbock County, Kansas. The family is said to be consisted of John Bender, his wife Elvira, their son John Jr., and their daughter Kate. They are estimated to have killed at least a dozen travelers and possibly as many as 20 before they were discovered. So, yeah, a very odd group, definitely.
Definitely.
So, a little background on them. So, sometime in October of 1870, 5 families of spiritualists homesteaded in and around the township of Osage, which is kind of weird. Spiritualist, but whatever.
Yeah, not really something you hear very often.
No, not really, but anyway. One of these families was the Benders. They registered 160 acres of land that was located adjacent to the Great Osage Trail, which was at that time the only road opening for traveling farther west. So they had a good location. So anybody that was going west at that time, going through that area, would be going on this trail. So, initially, John Sr. and John Jr. set up the farm alone. So they go out, they stake it out, they set it up. They built a house, a barn, a corral, and then they dug a well. And after all that work had been completed, Elvira and Kate then moved to the farm sometime in the fall of 1871. Now, they had this cabin that was divided into 2 rooms. They had like a canvas wagon, serving as its roof, and they used the smaller room that was located at the back as living quarters, and they used the front room as like a general store where they sold dry goods, and they also had a kitchen and dining area in the front room that operated as a small restaurant for travelers. And then they opened up what they considered to be an inn. So they started housing people here, supposedly, like just a couple people here. It wouldn't be like a bunch of people. It'd be like one person stopping by maybe once every few weeks or something. So, Elvira and Kate also planted a 2-acre vegetable garden and an apple orchard near the home. So, we're going to talk a little bit about the family. John Sr. was supposed to be around 60 years old during the time of all the mayhem, we'll say, and he was said to have spoken very little English. His speech was described as being guttural and usually unintelligible. So,
well, that's
a little weird, yeah.
Not actually, considering the time, I don't
well,
imagine
maybe,
it would be that uncommon.
I mean, just the way they're saying, I don't know. The way they're making it sound like he's just, you can't understand, I don't know. But Elvira, she was supposed to be around 55 years old, and she also spoke little English, and she was described as a she-devil by her neighbors due to her extreme unfriendliness.
Well, that's not very fortunate.
No, so you gotta wonder about her. Now, John Jr., he was supposed to have been around 25 years old, and he was described as a handsome man with auburn hair and a mustache. He is said to have spoken English fluently, though with a German accent, and some have considered him to be kind of a half-wit due to his bouts of laughing at odd times for no apparent reason. I don't know. Now, that could have been a tick or something.
Yeah.
I don't know. It could have been 1,000 different things. But anyway, Kate, the daughter, was supposed to have been around 23, and she was described as an attractive woman who spoke English very well with almost no accent, and she was said to have been a self-proclaimed healer and psychic. She was also known to distribute flyers advertising her supernatural powers and her so-called ability to cure illnesses.
Given the time, I don't think that would be exactly what you want to be advertising.
Not necessarily, no, because it's witch hunt. I mean, who knows? Who knows? I mean, it was still the 1800s, wasn't as bad, but yeah, still, you never know. So, she supposedly also conducted seances as well as giving lectures on spiritualism. She also gained notoriety for her promotion of the free love concept, which was basically this movement in which people were encouraged to embrace all forms of love, and it also sought to remove the state from matters dealing with relationships like marriage, birth, and all that. So, due to her popularity, this led many to visit the inn that they'd opened. So, the family was said to have mainly kept to themselves. However, Kate and John Jr. are said to have regularly attended Sunday school in Harmony Grove, which was located near the farm. So, they kind of kept to themselves, but kind of didn't, I guess. So they are believed to be German immigrants. However, there's no real documentation or definitive proof that that's correct. There's also nothing that shows the family's relationship to one another. There are some reports that Kate and John Jr. were husband and wife instead of brother and sister, but I don't know. There was never anything written. We don't know. So according to this man named Lee Ralph, who was supposed to been like a census taker or something, I guess, around this time, he says that there was a census from 1870 that shows John, age 53, Mary, age 49, John, age 24, and Catherine, age 13. So, it's making you think that they're a family. And it also says the family was reported as living in Decatur, Illinois. And it's also reported that the 3 eldest members of the family were born in Germany, and Kate was born in France. So, I don't know. I have no clue. So that might be why the accents were a little different, why she maybe could speak English better. Maybe she came over here earlier and had a little more, so that
it would make sense.
True. Right. So here's some descriptions from people who say they knew the family. Here's how they described them. So they described the father. They said, the old man was a repulsive, hideous brute without a redeeming trait. Dirty, profane, and ill-tempered. Sounds like a winner.
Oh, absolutely.
Then next was Elvira, the mother. Old Miss Bender was a dirty old Dutch crone. Her face was a fit picture of the midnight hag that wove the spell murderous ambition about the soul of Macbeth. So,
Jesus.
Yeah.
Christ.
Overly, yeah. They wanted to really drive home what this woman looks like.
They were not a fan of her.
Evidently not, because she's a she-devil too. So, the son, young Bender, seeing, when excited, recalled the grave-robbing hyena at once to mind. Which I guess was because he was always supposed to be laughing for no reason whatsoever or whatever.
Yeah.
But anyway, now Kate, they said, this is what they said about her. Kate proclaimed herself responsible to no one save herself. She professed to be a medium of spiritualism and delivered lectures on the subject. In her lectures, she publicly declared that murder might be a dictation for good, that in what the world might deem villainy, her soul might read bravery, nobility, and humanity. She also advocated free love and denounced all social regulations for the promotion of purity and the prevention of carnality.
She's a witch.
Yeah. Which she called miserable requirements of self-constituted society. So she was all about the free love, and she didn't think anybody should tell her what she could do with her body.
Now, to an extent, I can agree with that.
I do, to a point, sure.
To an extent, I agree with the whole my body, my choice thing.
To a point, sure.
But
yeah,
to the extent she's taking it, and the stuff she taught,
right?
Somebody needs to burn this witch.
Right. So she maintained carnal relations with her brother and boldly proclaimed her right to do so in the following words that were found in her lecture manuscript, which read, "Shall we confine ourselves to a single love and deny our natures their prosperous way? Even though it be a brother's passion for his own sister, I say it should not be smothered." So she's even saying basically that he is her brother, and she knows it. And I'm thinking this is why she's all about the free love thing, because people are against them being together, which, why wouldn't they be? It's disgusting, but whatever. That's them.
Well, to us, like to other cultures, it's perfectly normal. And
it
all
can
that,
be in
yeah.
some, sure, but
I imagine
anyway,
to most of our audience, it's rather disgusting.
It is. It is to me anyway, but whatever. So now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the deaths and disappearances that were linked to them. So sometime in May of 1871, the body of a man was discovered in Drum Creek. The man had a few injuries that led authorities to believe that he'd been murdered. And those were basically, he had a crushed skull and a cut throat. So.
Well, geez.
Yeah.
I don't know. It sounds like he killed himself.
He could have, I don't know. But anyway, there were never any arrests made or any real evidence to help move the case forward. But then again, like we talked back in, they pretty much had to catch them. Or somebody had to witness it or something. There wasn't no DNA and all that mess. So then in February of 1872, 2 more men were discovered with the same injuries as the man found in Drum Creek.
Sounds like they killed themselves.
Yeah, sounding like there's definitely something going on in this area. So then in 1873, there were several reports of people who had passed through the area that just sort of suddenly came up missing.
Suicide pact.
Yep. These bodies weren't found. These people were just missing. So this led others to start to avoid the area and the trail that passed through. Well, I wonder why. Now, another reason, the area that this all kind of happened in question was basically kind of a known area to kind of avoid anyway, as it was described as being just riddled with horse thieves and villains. So I'm guessing a lot of outlaws came through here.
Oh, absolutely.
So this led to the forming of what was called vigilance committees. And these groups would often arrest individuals in regards to the numerous missing people in the area. However, those that were arrested would all soon be released with no charges ever being filed.
Well, yeah, that's kind of just a group of vigilantes.
It's pretty much what it is.
That's not a legal arrest.
It's
it
not.
Never would have been considered a legal arrest.
Right, but I mean, they couldn't even find anything to charge them with after they brought them in. So it also led to several men who were probably really actually innocent being brought up on bogus charges because they were just rounding people up and bringing them in. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the downfall of the family. So these are basically the events that led up to, we'll say, the overall downfall. So sometime during the winter of 1872, there was this man named George Newton Longcore, and he left Independence, Kansas, along with his infant daughter, Mary Ann. Now, he had planned on resettling somewhere in Iowa. However, they never made it to their destination, and the pair were never seen again. So later, in the spring of the following year, his former neighbor, Dr. William Henry York, decided he was going to go searching for the man and his daughter because they should have gotten somewhere, something. He at least wanted to know what happened. So he questioned several homesteaders that were located along the trail that the pair were thought to have taken. However, he was unable to get any real help. He made it to Fort Scott, where he stayed for a bit to rest and gather some supplies. And then on March 9th, he set out again, heading towards Independence. However, he never made it there. So the first guy becomes missing. Another guy goes out looking for him. Now he's gone missing, going the same way he went. So, little suspicious. Right. Now here's where they made their mistake. Now York had two brothers. One was Ed York, who was living at Fort Scott at the time, and he was the one he stayed with while he was there for a little while and rested and whatever. And his other brother, though, was Colonel Alexander M. York, who was a Civil War veteran, a lawyer, and a member of the Kansas State Senate.
Well, all right then.
So, somebody you probably didn't want to mess with their families, just to be messing with them. But, now both of his brothers were fully aware of his travel plans. He had told them what was going on. He'd been in contact with them, telegrams, plus he just stayed with his other brother. He knew exactly when he left. They knew when he was supposed to be going and getting back and all that. So when he failed to return, they were immediately concerned, and they set out in search of their missing brother. Now, Colonel York took with him a company of approximately 50 men, and they set out and they began questioning every traveler they encountered along the trail. And then they went out and they went up and down and hit every homestead and started questioning everybody they came across. So
I think they may have made a slight error in judgment.
Exactly.
There.
So they were combing this area. Then, on March 28, 1873, Colonel York arrived at the Bender's Inn. He then began telling the family that his brother, had gone missing and he was out looking for him, or whatever. And an unknown member of the family readily admitted that Dr. York had passed their way and even stayed with them for a few nights before continuing on his way. They even hinted that he may have run afoul of the local Indian tribes. So Colonel York, he had to admit that could be a possibility. That could have been what had happened. Nothing was afoot yet. In other words, he didn't suspect them as of yet. So he then decided to stay, have dinner at the inn, and then he left. And then he later returned on April the 3rd because he had received a report from a woman who claimed that she had escaped from the family after Elvira had threatened her with a knife, and she'd managed to get away from him.
Uh-oh.
So he then takes a group of armed men with him this time, and they head out. Now, this is not the same group as before. These are actually some men that were in the town. So they all get armed up, and they go out there. Now, Elvira reportedly first acted like she couldn't understand English or even speak English at first. Like, she didn't understand what they were saying, the mother. However, the younger family members, they denied the claim. They were like, no, there was no woman out here, nothing, this didn't happen, whatever. He then repeated the claim again, and this made Elvira become enraged. And then she claimed that the woman was a witch who had cursed her coffee and ordered the men to leave her house. Now all of a sudden she can understand English and
Yeah, I was
speak.
about to say, it's a miracle.
Right.
She can speak English now.
Exactly, which this surprised York, as she now seemed pretty fluent in English and could speak rather well, as well, obviously fully understanding, what he was saying to her. But, however, there was really not enough proof of the claim, since it was essentially just the woman's word against the family. I mean, it was just some woman saying this, so she could have just been saying something.
That's fair.
There was no proof. So, however, the men that had accompanied him to the family's inn thought that the Benders and another neighboring family known as the Roaches were involved in the man's disappearance, and they wanted to just hang them all right then and be done with it. York was not ready to go that far with so little evidence, though, so he decided to leave. However, Kate supposedly stopped him and told him to return on Friday evening so that she could use her skill as a clairvoyant to aid him in the search of his brother, which he didn't do, but
yeah,
considering that, you know what I'm saying. But now, during this time, several neighboring communities began to blame the nearby Osage community for the disappearances. And this led to this meeting that they had at the Harmony Grove Schoolhouse. And supposedly around 75 people attended, including Colonel York. And it's even thought that John Bender and his son were there, but they're not sure. Now, after some discussion about the numerous disappearances, the group then decided to obtain search warrants that would allow them to search every homestead between Big Hill Creek and Drum Creek. Search them fully.
Yeah.
Go inside, do whatever they wanted to. So 3 days after the meeting, this man named Billy Toll was driving cattle past the Bender's property when he noticed that the inn appeared to be deserted. And when he got up and went and looked, it looked like their animals were behaving like maybe they hadn't been fed in a few days, like the cows were, different things. You could tell that they hadn't been fed in a while. He then reported his findings to the township trustee, who was kind of like the sheriff, which was the deputy sheriff.
Yeah.
However, due to bad weather in the area, the reports could not be investigated for a few days. So the trustee, once everything settled down and they could get out there, he called for volunteers. And several hundred men, including Colonel York, turned up to aid in the investigation. Now, upon their arrival at the inn, they found that the cabin was empty of food and clothing and all their possessions. So they had lit out. And they heard what was happening at that meeting, and they, what I'm saying.
They didn't want nothing to do with it.
Exactly. The men then noticed a foul odor permeating the cabin. So they started looking around, trying to find the source of it. And they were led to this trap door, which was nailed shut and located underneath this bed. They pried the door open, and underneath they found clotted blood just kind of splattered all around on this stone floor. They then used sledgehammers to break up the stone floor of the room. However, they didn't locate any remains. They then took a metal rod and began to probe around the cabin, focusing on the disturbed soil of the vegetable garden and the orchard. Later that evening, they discovered the body of Dr. York, buried in the orchard. He was found buried face down with his feet barely below the surface of the soil, so very shallow.
That's just lazy.
It is. It's just, you're right. So in the orchard is where they were said to have buried the majority of everything. But anyway, they continued their search until around midnight, where they discovered what they believed to be the site of 9 more graves. So they marked these sites, and it's getting dark, it's dark and everything, and so they just go home, and they're going to come back in the morning when they can see. So they returned the following morning, and they started digging. And they discovered another 8 bodies inside 7 of the marked sites that they had marked. They also found another body in a well, along with several varying body parts, which is, why would you throw a body in the well? Are they using that water kind of, what? That didn't make no sense.
I would assume not, because that would
I'm
make
on
them
a
very,
thing, maybe
very
they just
sick.
threw that one in there at the end, you know what I'm saying? Maybe it was the last victim kind of thing, and
It's
they
also
just
possible
trying to
that
get rid
the
of the
well
body
might
quick.
have been like dried up and stuff.
Possibly, I don't.
And they just used it as like a dumping ground.
Maybe, I don't know.
Either way, it's a weird choice.
It is. But, so it was reported that all but one had their head bashed in what was to believe to have been a hammer, and their throats had been cut. Except the only one that wasn't found in that state was the body of a young girl who they discovered that didn't appear to have any injuries, which led them to believe that maybe she might have been strangled or maybe even buried alive. They didn't know. Or she could have just died. I don't know. Who knows? A Kansas newspaper later reported that the men completing the search were so enraged at the discovery of the bodies that they then located a friend of the family who was a man named Brockman. The group then hung him from a beam inside the inn until he fell unconscious. They would then revive the man, interrogate him further before then hanging him until he was unconscious again. They did this 3 times before finally releasing him, and the man was said to have then staggered home as one who was drunk or deranged, which I guess so, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I guess he pretty much was in that state at that moment. But
Not to mention the probable brain damage.
I
that
mean,
he would
exactly,
have
because I don't know how long
sustained.
they were,
If
holding
they
him
were
up.
just constantly doing that until he was unconscious,
I mean, that's what I'm saying. I don't
imagine
know.
just a few times
I-
would be enough to cause at least a little bit of brain
Right,
damage.
so that's what I'm saying. I don't know. I don't know how long they were waiting, but still, yes, it wouldn't have been a good thing. Now, while they were searching the house, they also found this Roman Catholic prayer book, and it had notes that inside it that were written in German. Now, the writings inside it that they could read, it said something like Johanna Bender, born July 30th, 1848. John Gebhardt came to America on July 1st, 18, and they couldn't make out the rest of the date. And it was also something written that said Big Slaughter Day, January 8th, and Hell Departed. So I don't know what the heck that means.
That's interesting.
Very. I don't know what any of that means. It's just like these little notes they just found written in this book. It's weird. Now we're going to talk a little bit about what was considered to be their killing methods. Now, the reason I say considered to be is because we don't 100% know if this is what they did. This is just what was thought. So, it's believed that this, like an unsuspecting traveler, would be, sat at the dining room table where John Jr. or his father would lie in wait behind this curtain that they had hung up behind the chair. So there was I guess sort of like a little pantry thing there, a little cubby they could get into. And then they had a curtain hung up there, had the dining room table sitting in front of this curtain, back to the curtain. Father sitting behind, or the son sitting back there with a hammer. All right. Now, while this is going on, Kate was supposed to be distracting the person, talking to him, whatever, doing her spiritualism, free love crap, whatever. While she's doing that, they would then, lean out, pop him in the head with a hammer. Then, one of the women would run in and cut the guy's throat, or woman's throat, to ensure that they would perish, and they would then drop the body through the trap door that was in the floor that underneath that chair, which they think, is where they moved that bed to cover that door up so people wouldn't just immediately see it. So, now once the body was in the cellar, they would then be stripped and searched for anything of value. The body would then be buried somewhere on the property, like I said earlier, most often in the orchard, because that's what they did. Now, people thought and said that they mainly sought after those they felt had money, but another theory says that they killed indiscriminately for nothing more than the sheer thrill. And that's kind of makes you think that in some, because they didn't always get a big sum of money from people and some of their victims and stuff. So, I don't know. And testimony that was given by those who had stayed at the inn and did manage to get away sort of seemed to support some of the theories on how these murders were kind of taking place. So there was this man named William Pickering. Okay, so now he claims that he had, visited the inn or whatever, the restaurant part or whatever, and they told him to sit down near that curtain, but he'd refused to because it looked like it had bloodstains on it. And that when he refused to sit there, Kate then threatened him with a knife, which led him to just nope it out of there. He just took off. Exactly, which is probably why he's still alive.
Probably.
Now, that kind of makes you wonder then, because that woman said that she threatened her with a knife, Elvira, so there's 2 stories that are very similar. Somebody's not doing what they want to, the woman gets aggressive and starts, threatening them with a knife because the men are in hiding, so to speak. Kind of makes you wonder if that's not true then.
Yeah.
Now, they also managed to steal horses, clothes, and any other possessions the person was carrying under the guise that some people who stayed at the inn could only pay by barter. So they would leave that stuff with them to pay for them staying at the inn.
Relatively smart.
It is, and I mean,
compared
how
to
could
the
you?
other stuff they've done.
But how could you prove that people didn't just leave that stuff there?
You couldn't.
Exactly. If you couldn't find the person, how would you know?
Because back then, like, bills of sale and stuff weren't particularly common.
Not really.
And weren't enforced or anything.
Not necessarily. A lot of some of these places that were just really just territories, more or less, they weren't even states or anything in some of these areas. So inside the cabin, they also discovered more than a dozen bullet holes in the roof and the sides of the structure, which led them to the belief that maybe several victims might have fought back, or at least one had fought back after being struck with a hammer. Just didn't maybe succumb, or whatever. They ended up hitting them again, whatever. Ran out of bullets, who knows. So now we're going to talk a little bit about them being on the run. So the detectives on the case followed the tracks which had been left by the family's wagon, and then they soon discovered the family's wagon, which had been abandoned, along with a team of starving horses. It was later confirmed that the family had purchased tickets on the Leavenworth, Lawrence, and Galveston Railroad to travel to Humboldt. John Jr. and Kate were supposed to have later left the train and boarded another train, which was headed south. And then they arrived, John and Kate, John Jr. I should say, and Kate supposedly then arrived in this place near Denison, Texas. They then were supposed to have traveled to this unknown outlaw colony that they'd heard about that was located somewhere near the border of Texas and New Mexico. And the reason they had chosen this place is because in the hopes that they would not be pursued, and they weren't pursued, as lawmen who entered this area were not known to come back out. So they picked a good area to go into.
Smart place to retreat
unless
to.
they, whatever. Now, it was later reported that there was an officer who supposedly traced them to the border, and he says he discovered that John Jr. had passed away due to this possible medical emergency where something had ruptured, kind of thing, like appendix or something. Don't know. Several groups claimed that they found the family and had killed them, like a bunch of outlaws and vigilante groups said they killed them, they found them, they lynched them. A bunch of them came forward and said they did. However, there was a reward offered, which would have been about $75,000 in today's money that was never claimed. Never claimed, so they didn't ever have the bodies or anything. Right. They had something to show. So the search for the family has continued on and off, or did continue on and off for the next 50 years. With several reports coming in of spotting Kate and her mother. Now, as for arrests in regards to these crimes, we'll say. So 12 men in total, who were described as a bad repute in general, were arrested in connection to the Benders. So I don't know what that means. I'm guessing they just had bad reputations of being involved in shady crap. So anyway. One of them was Addison Roach, which was one of the Roach family that I said earlier, and his son-in-law, William Buxton. They were arrested as supposed accessories, and it was claimed that all the men involved were basically, the ones that they arrested they were saying that they were helping them in the disposal of some of the items that they had stolen from the men. That's how they were accessories. So they weren't actually, I guess, involved. Well, I don't know. They may help dispose the bodies too. I don't know. So there was this another man named Mitt Cherry who was actually a member of that vigilance committee. He was arrested in regards to his part in forging a letter to one of the victim's wives indicating that the man had arrived safely at his destination. So that's the good committee they had formed there, right? But anyway, so sometime on October 31st, 1889, an arrest report was made for a Mrs. Elmira Monroe, also known as Elmira Griffith, and Mrs. Sarah Eliza Davis. And this happened in Niles, Michigan, and it was for larceny. So they were found not guilty of that, but they were immediately rearrested for the Bender murders.
Yep.
Now, it was reported by the Pittsburgh Dispatch that the daughter of one of the victims, her name was Mrs. Frances E. McCann. She had reported the pair of women to the authorities in early October after she'd been able to track them down. So she went out and looked for them. I guess they killed her father, and she's like, no, So McCann stated that she had been having dreams about her father's death, which she then shared with Sarah Eliza. Their identities were later supposedly confirmed by a tintype photo that was shown to two witnesses from the Osage Township, and that said that they were Elvira and Kate. Don't know. There was this tintype photo, and you know how great the quality of those were.
Yeah.
So sometime in mid-October, this deputy sheriff, Leroy Dick, who was the township trustee who had led the investigation to search the family's property, he arrived in Michigan. He arrested the pair, And he says that he reported that Monroe, she initially resisted, declaring that she would not be taken alive. However, she was quickly subdued by deputies and she was taken alive. So Sarah Davis, now she was the younger of the two, she claimed that Monroe was Elvira Bender. However, she claimed that she was not Kate, but Elvira's sister Sarah. She later signed an affidavit attesting this to be true. Monroe denied being Bender and then accused Sarah of actually being Kate, and they were later taken before a 13-member panel. 7 of the members identified the women as Kate and Elvira, and so they sent them to be tried. So I'm kind of wondering how much these people look like them, really.
Yeah.
7 only of 13 said they thought they did. I don't know. So the women were ultimately released since there was not really any evidence that was presented to prove who they were. They may have been, of course, this may have actually been the correct decision, as Elvira, as we said before, she could speak English and understand English, but she had a really heavy accent and she wasn't very fluent in English. And this woman spoke very fluent English with no accent, that woman who was supposed to be Elvira. So it's kind of thinking that's probably wasn't them, and it's unclear what happened to them or how they ended up. We don't know, which is nuts.
It is, very much so.
That they did all that and just, bam, gone.
Just vanished.
But
thin air, basically.
There you go. And so ends the tale of the Bloody Benders.
That was an interesting one.
It was out there. It was way out there. It was very, very interesting just because, my goodness.
Honestly, I think if they hadn't have made, 3 mistakes that they did, they would have gotten away with it and could have kept on going.
They probably could have. And who's
if they hadn't killed that one
didn't?
guy. Well, yeah, true. But
they
I
could
meant
just
where
moved
they
on.
were.
Right.
If they hadn't killed that one guy, if they hadn't have buried the body in, the most shallowest grave ever.
Exactly.
And if they had hid that hatch a little better.
Yeah.
Could have easily been done. All 3 of those things could have easily not have happened.
True. But they didn't, and that's what happens. They got cocky, they got caught, and here we go. But anyway, we hope you really enjoyed that episode. I know I did, because it was out there, and that's the kind of things I like. So don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe, and don't forget to stay disturbed.